Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Handwriting Examination. Please note, the information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law sans the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Sheila will discuss types of cases, two kinds of handwriting experts, types of forgery, synchronized writing, range of variation, and size of forgery. To give you a little background about our presenter, Sheila Lowe is a forensic handwriting examiner who holds a Master of Science degree in psychology. Although most of her practice deals with civil matters, she is often court-appointed in criminal cases and works with offices of the public defender. She has taught forensic handwriting examination at the University of California, Riverside campus in the SCSI certificate program and at UC Santa Barbara in the Discovery program. The author of The Complete Idiot's Guide to Handwriting Analysis, Handwriting of the Famous and Infamous, and the Forensic Handwriting series, Sheila has written articles for numerous Bar Association magazines and many more. She practices in the area of handwriting application and behavioral profiling. Her website is www.sheilalowe.com. Attending to required password, the word for today is handwriting. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located at the left of your screen. Please note that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes. You are also required to complete a survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archived recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list to the left of your screen. Thank you for all attending today. And Sheila, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. And good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. It's still morning here in sort of cloudy Southern California. So I'm here to talk to you about handwriting examination and what the attorney needs to know about the handwriting expert, because thousands of arrests are made every year in cases of fraud and forgery. And as we know, identity theft is skyrocketing. But it's not just strangers who steal our identity and forge our signatures. Many of the cases that I deal with are family members who are trying to cheat each other. So chances are, if you haven't yet retained a handwriting expert on a case, at some point you probably will. So today I hope to provide some information that's going to be helpful when you get such a case. And there are many different types of cases involving handwriting. For example, let me switch slides here. I deal with real estate cases such as signatures on trust deeds, home sales, business sales, and so on. Cases of wills, for instance, when dear old dad runs off with a bimbo girlfriend. He dies, then his kids get written out of a will, a new will is produced, and her kids get everything. So that is fairly common. There are cases of anonymous notes, which include stalkers, employee threats, whistleblowers, and I've received several lately about bomb threats in high schools. There are celebrity cases, such as I've been asked to authenticate signatures of Hemingway, Elvis, Lucille Ball. And long ago, there was a document examination case involving John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Missing persons. A credit card receipt turned up in another country signed by a person who had been missing. The fear was that if the signature was not genuine, the person had been killed. Unfortunately, in that case, it was not his signature. Elder abuse is unfortunately all too common, where someone is given the responsibility of caring for an elderly or infirm person, and they're found to forge that person's name on checks or other documents. In some cases, a caregiver has even married their charge and stolen their bank accounts. Sibling rivalry. Family members forge names on powers of attorney, wills, other documents. I think my largest case involved two sisters who were fighting over a $96 million estate. Then there's medical records. A person has had surgery and then claims that the consent form was not signed by him or her. Prenups, log entries. That has to do with synchronous writing, and we're going to look at an example of that in a few minutes. But let's say you've now got a forgery case and you need to call a handwriting expert. What do you need to know? Well, basically there are two kinds of handwriting expert. That is, two kinds of training. On one side, there's a person with law enforcement training. They've usually learned on-site in a government lab and sometimes practice with a mentor. And these are people who work for the police, the post office, the FBI, Secret Service, and so on. The other type is, like me, who are privately trained and mentored. So what's the difference? Privately trained people use special equipment, and so do law enforcement people. Both have knowledge of handwriting characteristics. We learn about all the parts of handwriting. But there is a difference in that the law enforcement trained document examiner trains only in document examination, whereas many of the privately trained people are also trained in personality assessment. Now, we usually keep the two quite separate in court, but there is a lot of, let's just say it's really helpful to understand the effects of personality on handwriting. Unfortunately, the privately trained experts have had a lot of challenges from the other ones, the law enforcement trained, because they believe that they are the only ones who are qualified, and they often challenge private examiners as not being trained. But the fact is that hasn't worked in court, and we do receive very similar training. In fact, the Secret Service has a training program in handwriting authentication, and in their bibliography, they mention an old book by a man named Robert Sadek titled Experiments in Handwriting. So Sadek was a Czechoslovakian document examiner. And in his book, Experiments in Handwriting, he says that there are three types of graphology. Well, graphology is it's basically two Greek words, graphine and logos, that together mean the study of handwriting. And so in the book, he talks about the three types of handwriting examination. First of all, there's experimental graphology. That deals with how the document is written. It has to do with the physical, measurable, observable features of handwriting, and also the mechanical, material, and the circumstances of the writing. And this can include the writing materials, the writing instruments, the surface that the person wrote on, and the conditions that they wrote under. So that's number one, experimental graphology. Number two has to do with who wrote the document. And that takes the findings of experimental graphology and interprets them to handwriting authentication to determine the identity of the writer. So number two, forensic graphology, is who wrote it. Number three has to do with character and psychological graphology. So again, we take the first one, the measurable, observable aspects of handwriting, and we apply that in a different area. We're looking at the causes of handwriting. So that interprets the findings of the experimental graphology, and we discover why the writing looks like it does. And one of those aspects is character. Others are age, health, physical and mental condition, medications, other chemical substances, and so on. Now, when you contact your expert about a case, they're going to need certain information from you. And So you can expect to get asked a whole bunch of questions. Let's look at these. The first thing that I want to know as an expert is, do you have original documents? Originals are always best evidence. Without originals, my opinion is always going to be qualified. But having said that, it's pretty rare for me to get originals. If you don't have the originals, where are they? Where are they stored? Will I be able to go look at them? Is it possible for me to go there and photograph them? If not, and if all you have are machine copies or scans, I want to know what quality they are. A color photograph is the next best thing to an original. A high-res color scan would be the next to that, and then it goes on down the line. Of course, a black and white photocopy is going to be the worst, but sometimes they're still usable. But also, if they are a photocopy, I want to know, is it a first-generation photocopy, or what generation down the line, because each generation of copy is going to have an effect on the line quality of the writing. The next thing I want to know is, what is the approximate age of the person who is alleged to have signed the document? Which hand do they write with? What's their eyesight? Are they using glasses or contact lenses, or were they at the time of the purported writing? What about medications? What is their mental and physical health? Could it have affected the handwriting? Medications and drugs. If they're taking medications, what are they taking? Some drugs will affect handwriting. Recreational drugs and alcohol certainly affect handwriting. So if you have that information, that would be important to know. Could the person have had an assisted hand? In other words, sometimes when people are bedridden, somebody else will actually hold their hand and try to guide the signature. When that happens, the person who is holding the hand, some of their own characteristics often will come through into that signature. So that's going to affect the signature. Also, coercion. Is that a possibility? Was the person forced into signing? What about the writing surface? Was it a desk? Was the person leaning on a magazine on their knees? Or were they on a helicopter? All those things are going to have an effect on handwriting. So writing position. And if you don't have adequate exemplars for comparison, will I be able to obtain request writing? This is not the best kind of exemplars. Attorneys frequently call me and say, well, in a deposition, I asked the person to sign his name 10 times. In most cases, that alone is not going to be adequate for examination because it's considered self-serving. The person could attempt to alter their handwriting. So it's always better to have course of business writing. Next, I want to know if a written report will be required, because if my findings don't jive with what you are hoping for, probably don't want a written report. So I only write a report when my attorney-client asks me to. I'd like to know who the parties to the suit are so that we can do a conflict check. Also like to know if there is an opposing document examiner on the other side. Unfortunately, like in probably all fields, there are hired guns. This is a very small field, and usually somebody with a bad reputation is going to be well known. And I'm the ethics chair of the Scientific Association of Forensic Examiners, and as such, I'm aware of dossiers that exist to help impeach some of these people. Finally, the all-important question, who's going to pay me? It's always best, whenever possible, for the client attorney to be the person who retains the expert. Excuse me. As the expert, I prefer all of my communications to take place directly with the attorney, not with the client. Now, having gathered all of this information, the document examiner sends their CV and retainer agreement. And in most cases, a competent expert is not going to work without a signed retainer agreement and payment of the retainer. I have personally learned to do this the hard way. But before retaining any expert, I strongly suggest checking out any claims that they make on their CV. There are expert organizations that can vouch for their members. As I've mentioned, the Scientific Association of Forensic Examiners, we have posted on our website about a former member who was expelled but who continues to claim they are certified by our organization. So if somebody hires that person and doesn't check them out, that could be a problem if the opposing document examiner comes to court and challenges them on that basis. It could make you look bad if you haven't done your checking up, due diligence. Now we're going to turn to the different types of forgers and forgery. There are, different circumstances under which people forge. Many, probably most, are amateurs who are in a situation they figure they'll just try it out. Opportunist maybe finds a credit card with a signature on the back and decides to use it. And the professional. It's extremely rare to find a good forgery, but it happens. And I suppose if the person is a real professional, chances are the forgery is going to get by him. We'll never know. How would we know if he's a really good forger? Types of forgery. There are several types. There's a skillful simulation, which is where someone with some artistic skill takes a model signature and practices until they're able to produce some kind of reasonable facsimile. There is a non-skilled simulation, which is just what it sounds like. This is someone who tries to copy the model but doesn't do very well. Then we have someone who makes no attempt to copy. They just write the name or some other name. Who knows? The two signatures that you see on the screen, one says Mickey Mouse and the other says "You been had sucker." And these were actually written on the signature line of a check. Tracings are less common today, but I have had some cases of tracing. Electronic copies are more popular. Sometimes a person will take a genuine signature and scan it. Then they're able to copy and paste it into a spurious document. Actual cut and paste are rare now, but they do happen. But it's more likely that it's an electronic signature. So if you don't have an original, there's no way to prove that an electronic copy wasn't made spuriously. Okay, let's look at a little closer at what it takes to forge someone's handwriting. When you go to school and you start to write, first thing you write is individual letters. And this is called letter impulse. You write one letter at a time. Then you learn to string the letters together, and that's word impulse. Now, of course, today we have a problem with schools not teaching cursive writing, and that's another whole lecture. But older people are still writing in cursive. But either way, once you learn to write whole words, whether it's connected or disconnected, you're writing in word impulse. And once you've done that and you're comfortable with writing in words, you begin to write in sentence impulse. So you can write a whole sentence without stopping to think about each individual letter. Everyone in a particular class learns the same method, and that produces class characteristics, which is a term that you're probably familiar with. This is the Danielian copybook, which has been in use in schools since about 1980. Class characteristics are factors common to a specific group of writers. Years ago, older writers will have learned the Palmer or the Zehner-Blosser. Kids of my kids' age, in their 40s, learned Danielian. But now there are others, such as a New American Cursive, Cursive Logic, and probably a whole lot more. But each person who learns the specific style has learned the class characteristics. They all learn the same thing. Once you've mastered the class characteristics, various factors that affect handwriting that we covered earlier will come into play and changes begin to take place. And we can say that individual characteristics creep in. You can individualize your handwriting in many different ways. You can simplify it by cutting off non-essential strokes and loops and beginning strokes and ending strokes. You may elaborate and make the capital letters fancy or make bigger loops or anything to elaborate it. You may print, or you may stick with your own form of copybook. But once you have developed your own individual style, we say that you've reached graphic maturity. This is the unique characteristics that a writer brings to his or her script and are unlikely to be used by other writers in exactly the same manner. That's why a document examiner can usually authenticate handwriting or a signature. So once you have reached graphic maturity, we can say that you have created your own master pattern. And a master pattern is the way a writer makes his particular letter forms within the natural variations that occur. I'm sorry to see that my font that I chose didn't translate to this slide. You know how computers are. I had different forms of the letter A. So I'll just tell you that each person has their own ways of making each letter. And you may have within your concept of, let's say, the letter A, at the beginning of a letter, of a word rather, the A may be different from the A in the middle of a word or at the end of a word. And the concept of how you make the A's, all the different ways you make the A's and all the other letters, those make up your master pattern. These are the structural components that make up the signature. And once a master pattern has been developed, the signature is going to look pretty much the same from one signing to the next, but it won't be exactly the same. We write our signature probably thousands of times through our lifetime, and it becomes a spontaneous act that we don't have to think about. That's why we tend to reproduce our own signature within a pretty close range. Now, there are some basic propositions about writing skill that the expert needs to keep in mind, and this is important information for you too. First of all, a slow thinker cannot write fast. They're thinking slowly, so they're going to write more slowly. It's hard for a fast thinker to write slowly. So if you've you could try that experiment. If you think quickly and you write quickly, try to slow it down and see how that feels. Punctuation and grammar are very important. I'm going to show you an example of that. It's not just the handwriting. And you cannot write better than your skill level. I have a murder case at the moment in which there's a suicide note, and the person who's accused of writing the note has a much lower skill level than the handwriting on the note. Therefore, it's not possible for that person to have written it. Now let's switch over to something different, synchronous writing. Synchronous writing or log entries are made, the question is, can you tell whether the log entries were made sequentially or at different times? And this slide illustrates a particular type of pattern called margin drift that is seen when signatures are made in groups. And for an example, I have a huge insurance case where a doctor's office had individual sign-in sheets for each patient, and it suspected that people were being just sort of brought in on the street and asked to sign entire sheets 30 or so times, but not receiving any treatment. The doctor then bills the insurance company for those visits. So I've examined thousands of signatures in these cases, and I have also experimented with having volunteers sign many times, as I had in this slide. And it's really easy to identify sequential writing. It's not always this particular pattern, but this is a common one. Now, there are two important axioms. Oh, I guess we're going to stop here and take questions for 5 minutes. So,
if all the attendees enter the passcode for the day, Our first question is, handwriting changes over time. How can you analyze it?
Well, actually, we're going to cover that in range of variation. And what's important is for the handwriting exemplars to be produced around the time that the questioned writing was written, because for that very reason. And I will be going into that in more detail.
Okay. If you print everything and do not use cursive, can that handwriting be analyzed?
Yes, it can, because there are so many different variables in handwriting that it's a little harder in some cases, but there's still the individual characteristics are going to be evident. So any kind of writing can be analyzed.
What does certain handwriting say about a person, i.e. messy, bubbly, etc.?
Well, that has to do with personality. And that is kind of outside the scope of our discussion today, but it does show a lot about what type of person they are. I've just been asked to do that kind of work to talk about the suspect in a case that I'm on where I have done some handwriting authentication on the signature, but now they want me to talk about the personality of the person who's bringing the lawsuit. But usually we don't mix the two.
How can, for privately trained document examiners, how much difference is there between the types of training? Are some courses or schools of thought disfavored or under attack?
Well, I think I covered that right in the beginning, that we really have the same basic training. I think that the main difference is that law enforcement examiners usually have a full-time apprenticeship in a lab, whereas privately trained examiners have a more of an informal mentorship, which is done not on site, but through the computer and email and phone. But basically the training is the same. We use the same training materials.
Do ambidextrous people have similar characteristics when they write with one hand versus another?
I'm not sure I heard the beginning of that.
Do ambidextrous people have similar characteristics?
Okay. Being ambidextrous is extremely rare, but because handwriting comes from the brain, not just from the hand, their characteristics are going to be very similar. It may bring out different aspects of personality, but sometimes people will change hands to try to forge, and that's usually unsuccessful.
Is it difficult to analyze numbers written in a medical chart as opposed to words?
No. Numbers are an important part of the examination. Medical charts or checks. For example, if somebody's trying to forge a check, they are unlikely, they'll think about the signature, but they're unlikely to think about the other parts of the check, like the numbers and the dates, and those are identifying factors. Or in one case, I had a 7-page anonymous letter, but the only thing that really for sure identified the person was the way they wrote the zip code. So numbers, every part of the document is important. And I'm going to show that in the next section.
Next question, how can we be sure the signature is not a copy?
Because a copy, do you mean a photocopy? I'm not sure whether that question means if it's a photocopy or a simulation.
I guess a copy of the original signature.
Okay. Well, looking at it under the microscope, it's very easy to see. And even if it's a high-resolution scan at 30 power or 40 power, don't need to go that high actually, the pixelation will show. And so there are certainly ways to see. If it's a copy, if it's a copy from a laser printer, there are certain characteristics to look at. And if it's a copy from an inkjet printer, there are going to be different characteristics, but it's very easy to determine whether it's a copy or an original.
Okay, thank you so much. You can continue with the presentation.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to go on now with 2 important axioms in document examination, and this is why we can identify handwriting. because no individual signs his or her name exactly the same way twice, and you might try doing that. You won't be able to do it. It's impossible, and this has been proved by research. You cannot sign your name exactly the same way twice. So if you see two identical signatures, one of them is a fake. The other thing is that no two people, individuals, write exactly the same way. Now we're going to go into range of variation, which was asked in one of those questions. Everyone has a natural range of variation. And so some people are remarkably consistent over a long period of time. That's why it's important to get exemplars that are done around the time of writing. But it's good to also have them over a period of time. I had a case where a man in his 80s, he had died, but they produced signatures from his original Social Security card when he was 16, all the way through his life to his 80s. His handwriting, his signatures were remarkably consistent. Others, on the other hand, may have 5 or 6 signatures during the same time period. And then we would say that those people have a wide range of variation. So because of the fact that people have different ranges, it isn't possible in most cases to make a determination with only 1 or 2 exemplars. There's no set number. It really depends on the situation. But if possible, I like to have at least 10 and preferably more. But it's not always possible. Basically, you're going to get one of 3 answers, and the answer is going to depend on the quality and the quantity of the exemplars you provide. Either I'm going to tell you it is genuine, it's not genuine, or it's inconclusive. That's always unsatisfying for me and for my client, but sometimes it's the only answer. Now, going back to the concept of the master pattern, our master pattern is made up of many, many elements, and I'm just going to show you a few of them. This is to illustrate why it's so difficult to successfully forge. We look at the baseline, the placement of the baseline, the alignment of the baseline, the way the writing form, that's the design of the letters, how much it's connected, how fast it is, because we can see speed in handwriting. We look at the spacing, the pressure, the slant, initial and final strokes, capital letters, because the forger will try to copy the most obvious features of a writing, like the capital letters. But actually, the most unconscious part of handwriting is the spatial arrangement, the way the signature is laid out, how much space is left between the letters and the words, and the punctuation and the speed. And I already discussed that numbers are important and punctuation is important. We look at patching, and that's where a person may go back and try to fix something that didn't look quite right, just like soldering. Misspellings are extremely important. And tremor. The thing that alerts us to many of forgeries is the slowness. It's kind of like trying to paint by numbers rather than being an artist who paints naturally. The forger has to stop and think about each individual stroke. Consequently, the resulting signature often has tremor or shakiness, and we're going to look at some in a minute. But first I want to share a case that I testified in that was in the news a few years ago, and the point is to illustrate how important punctuation and syntax are. You may remember the case of a man who was calling himself Clark Rockefeller. He was not a Rockefeller, but he came to the public eye in 2008 when he violated a court order for supervised visits with his young daughter. He kidnapped her off the street in Boston, took her away from the social worker she was with. 6 days later, he was arrested, and it was discovered that he had been a person of interest in a 1985 murder case in California. And it's a really long and interesting story. At least one movie was made about it and some documentaries. But we'll just cut to the chase. He was using the name Christopher Chichester, which was one of his many aliases, and he rented a guest house from a young couple in San Marino, California, from a couple called John and Linda Sohus. He was actually a German student named Christian Karl Gerhardt's writer, but we'll say Chichester because it's easier. So one day, John and Linda disappeared, and Chichester told people that they had gone to Europe. He left town, never came back, and some of Linda Sohus's relatives and her boss received postcards from her that were postmarked Paris. She and John were never seen or heard from again. About a year later, Chichester was stopped in Massachusetts for a traffic violation. He was found to be driving a truck belonging to John Sohus, but he was a silver-tongued devil, and he managed to talk his way out of a ticket and slipped away. 1994, human remains were found in the backyard of the home where the guest house was, along with evidence pointing to Chichester. The remains were later identified as the bones of John Sohus. Linda Sohus never came back. No remains or anything surfaced. So fast forward. Several handwriting experts were shown 2 of the postcards and some of Linda's known handwriting. They were asked to opine on whether she had written the postcards, and they all said, no, she didn't, these experts who were published in various media. I was asked by the Pasadena Star-News newspaper, and I disagreed with their findings. My findings were published in the paper, and I was subsequently ordered by a grand jury to turn over all my materials, though I had not been retained in the case. And later, when I went to trial, I got a call from Mr. Gerhardt's writer's attorney who wanted me to testify on his behalf. Their theory of the case was that Linda Sohus had killed her husband and disappeared, and that it was her handwriting on the postcards. I said I didn't want to testify because I believed their client to be guilty, but he assured me that all I had to do was tell the truth. So in 2013, I appeared in Los Angeles Superior Court. It was the shortest time I've ever spent on the stand. I think it was about 10 minutes. And by the way, the sheriff's document examiner agreed with my findings. We were on the same side. So in cross-examination, the district attorney asked me only 2 questions. So, Ms. Lowe, you believe that Linda Sohus wrote the postcards? Yes. Do you know under what circumstances they were written? No. And of course, what I didn't say was, as far as I know, he could have had a gun to her head. I have no idea. He was convicted and given a 27-year sentence. So having told you all that, I'm going to show you just 2, actually one of the many, many items I examined, just to illustrate how important syntax and spelling and punctuation are. This is one of the postcards. Notice the box that I have put around the word kinda. Kinda is an idiosyncratic term. Also, the arrows point to dashes. Now, setting aside the rest of the writing, which I did examine and identify, just looking at those items. Okay, now let me show you an example. This is an exemplar of Linda Sohus writing. You'll notice it's signed Cody. She was an artist, and her professional name for art was Cody. She had actually quite a few different styles of handwriting, but I found in this one the word kinda and that she used dashes for punctuation. So we have to look at a whole lot of other things besides just the handwriting. This syntax being the same is very significant. The expert has to look at the whole picture, not just the individual pieces. So let's look at some of the signs of possible forgery. Someone who's signing an unaccustomed name is not writing naturally. They're drawing. Remember I said it's like painting by numbers like you did when you were a child. So in drawing the name, you have to go slowly. So there may be patching when the person goes back and tries to change what they've written. There may be tremor. There may be, oops, I'm not showing you here. Pen lifts in places where they don't belong, hesitations, which we see under the microscope, or blobs of ink where they don't belong. So these are all primary signs of forgery. But sometimes, rather than trying to copy someone else's handwriting, a person will try to disguise their own writing in order to deny having written it. I had a case of a piece of jewelry a person bought for $27,000, and then they denied having signed the receipt. So this happens from time to time. And what we look for in those cases is where the person switches hands and uses the hand that they're unused to writing, the unaccustomed hand. They change the slant or the direction, the speed. They'll slow it up or speed it up or slow it down. The pressure is usually heavier. They may change from print to cursive or vice versa, add ornamentation. Sometimes they try to make the writing look less developed, like a younger person or a person with mental challenges. And sometimes the signature length may be widened or compacted. Simulating a signature is a very difficult thing to do. So either in the case of someone who's disguising their writing, they try to make their signature look different from normal, whereas the forger tries to make the signature look the same as somebody else's. But in order to forge, there are two very difficult processes that a forger must do. To simulate someone's signature, you have to put aside your own master pattern and ignore your natural inclinations, and you have to take on the master pattern of the person whose name you're simulating. This is an extremely difficult thing to do. It's like trying to copy the way someone walks or talks, and that's why a successful forgery is pretty rare. You write the way you do for a reason. Your individual characteristics are unique to you because they're the result of all the experiences you've ever had in your life, everything you've ever seen or heard. Your handwriting is a picture of the inner you and everything that affects it, both internal factors and external factors. So often the forger's own writing patterns and personality will appear in writing that is not his own because he doesn't understand the meaning of the name or the writing to the person it belongs to. And he's only able to copy some of the aspects of the signature mechanically, but then they're going to look mechanical and drawn, not genuine. So those factors, internal and external, let's just go back and review them for a moment. 3 factors that affect all handwriting. Regardless of who is writing and regardless of what they're writing, everyone is affected by physiological conditions such as age, illness, medications, trauma, fatigue, etc. We're affected by the writing materials, the writing instrument, the writing surface, the position you're sitting in, and the psychological aspects, your mental and emotional state, any trauma that could affect your handwriting. Now, I spoke earlier about attempting to simulate someone's name as often producing tremor or shaking, but sometimes tremor is caused by illness. So let me just show you a couple of examples. These two are the Tremor of Forgery. The one that says Mel Wolfe has a certain kind of tremor that we associate with forgery. And you see the shakiness on the initial stroke here and on the end stroke. This other one, Jim Glaze, is written where it's written slowly. It doesn't have the same kind of tremor. It has a different kind of tremor. But this, again, is associated with forgery. Here is one kind of tremor of illness. This lady, I believe she had a stroke. Parkinson's has a very different kind of tremor, and then we see a case of what's called micrographia. The handwriting gets way smaller in Parkinson's. So it's important to know what the person's medical history is. Now, to determine whether it is a forgery, there's 2 things that we have to know. There must be significant fundamental differences and no unexplainable differences. And what that means is explainable differences would include those factors that we just looked at, the physiological, psychological, and mechanical. So if it may be able to be explained that way. Fundamental differences are major structural differences in handwriting, and that would include things like differences in the line quality, the pressure patterns, the skill level, the rhythm, the baseline, and many other characteristics. So if it's to be determined to be a forgery, then there must be no unexplainable differences. So the forger has two choices. They can copy the signature slowly and make it look the same, maintain pictorial similarity, as in this one. The one with the darkened background is the simulation, and you can see it's written very slowly, and they've attempted to copy the correct signature on the right. But because they did it so slowly, it suffered from a pictorial problem. If they don't do that, they can write it more quickly and more naturally, but you're not going to have the pictorial quality. The correct signature here in the bottom one is on the left, and the one on the right was the attempt at simulation. It didn't look at all like her signature. Okay, thinking like a forger. When I teach, I have students try to simulate this signature. It's not all that easy, and you might try it sometime. If you find it hard to do, here's what some forgers do. They turn it upside down. It's actually a lot easier because you're losing your frame of reference. Your master patterns for what that J looks like, the name was Jennifer Treget. For your master patterns for each of those letters, you lose that frame of reference with it upside down, and you're just looking at the shapes. And so that way, it's a bit easier. So for the last few slides here, I'm going to show you some cases. See what your visual perception is. Here's 4 signatures. One of them is not like the others. This was a young woman who was a notary who was arrested for signing a real estate document. She said that her aunt, who worked in her office, had stolen her notary stamp while she was out to lunch and forged her name on the documents. One of these documents has the Tremor of Forgery, and if you said it's the third one, you were correct. Now, sometimes I deal with not just signatures, but whole letters. And in this case, this is a known exemplar. This is written from a guy in jail to his girlfriend, and I'm just going to point to you 2 little idiosyncratic letter forms here. Look especially at the R and the G. Now, the young lady who is the mother of his child, this is a custody issue, received a very hateful letter from him that he was denying having written. And you see, if you look at it just quickly, the writing looks kind of different. Mood has an effect on handwriting, and if he wrote this when he was very angry, it's going to look different. But look at these 2 letters. There's other things in it, but today I'm showing you these 2 letters which identify him as the writer. Okay. Let's see, we have another one here. Oh, this one is a $12 million case in which the client's tax attorney produced a letter stating that, as I recall, it forgave him the loan, the $12 million. The client denied signing the letter. And this was a very dramatic case because the tax attorney brought a gun to a deposition and threatened the other attorney, who was my client. The judge ordered that any future meetings had to be conducted at the courthouse with a marshal present. Unfortunately, 2 years after this tax attorney lost his case and his $12 million, one of my client attorneys was murdered in his driveway. The case was never solved. So looking at these, and I had many exemplar signatures of the client, the range of variation was quite wide, and the question signature did not fit in several ways. Now, I've shown this to many students, and they're usually able to quickly pick out, as I hope you did, the top signature is the question signature that did not fit with the rest. This is the forged signature. And the last one is an insurance case where one of the children had an accident. The insurance agent produced a waiver stating that the children were not going to be covered. It turns out that the claimant, Donald Hadley, had years ago had a brain tumor, he had surgery for a brain tumor many years ago, And subsequently, when he signed his name, he left out some of the letters. So for that and several other reasons, it was my opinion that the question signature, which is clearly the second one down, was not genuine. And there was a document examiner on the other side of that case who was one of the hired guns that I mentioned earlier, who lies about their credentials, and that document examiner was impeached. So when you need exemplars, you may not know where to go. On my website here at this address, you can download a copy of this form, which is 101 places to look for exemplars. And if you need to find me for any reason, if there's questions that you haven't got to ask today that you want to ask me, I can be found in many places. And then here they are. So, have I told you everything you need to know, or do we have some more questions?
Yes, we do. If all the attendees can enter the passcode. Okay, first question is, how can you analyze my handwriting that is illegible?
Analyze it for personality traits, I think you mean, and in that case, I don't need to be able to read the writing to analyze it. I analyze handwritings. I have clients all over the world, and I only speak English, but I analyze in all different languages, including Hebrew and Arabic.
Next question, isn't handwriting just a reflection of school teaching?
Well, no. As I talked about early on, you learn your class characteristics, but then you individualize your handwriting as you grow and change, and you'll either simplify or elaborate, or you'll change your writing in many ways, and that it becomes an individual. And the post office has done a study looking at over 1 million handwritings, and they have determined that handwriting is individual to the person.
What does the term brain writing indicate?
Brain writing simply means that our handwriting is coming not just from our hand, but it starts in the brain. And you know, in the brain, everything that's ever happened to you throughout your life is stored there. We don't remember all that stuff off the top of our heads, but sometimes something you see or hear will stimulate a memory from childhood. It's all there. So when you go to write, those experiences that you've had coalesce in your brain, the way you've responded to them, and it comes down the nerves out your hand and is reflected in the ink line on the paper. So that's what brain writing is. So let me just elaborate a little bit. A person who is right-handed and loses the use of their hand and has to switch to their other hand, or has to use a pen in their mouth, as some people do, their handwriting, after they have gotten used to doing that, their handwriting will be pretty much like it was originally, and that's because the handwriting comes from the brain and not just the hand. I hope that makes sense.
Yes. How difficult is it to determine that a signature was made by a person attempting to disguise his own signature to be able to claim later that his signature was forged?
Okay, well, we did cover that a little bit. That's auto forgery or self-forgery, and his or her own characteristics are usually still going to show, unless it's a person with great artistic skill. Then all bets are off. But usually, it's not so difficult. I mean, your own characteristics are going to come through, because a forger doesn't know what things to hide. A person who's trying to disguise their own signature will change things like the capital letters, or the slant, or the size, but there are many other factors that an expert looks at.
Are FBI-trained examiners generally arrogant about their skills?
Well, the ones I've run into have been. I don't know about all of them. For some reason, they like to say that a person who's trained in behavioral aspects of handwriting doesn't know what they're talking about. But the fact is, when you know about behavior and the effect it has on handwriting, you really have a leg up on a person who doesn't. And I've never been disqualified, even though I've had government-trained examiners try to have me disqualified, but it hasn't worked because they don't know what they're talking about. They're criticizing something they don't know whereof they speak.
Are cultural differences important in handwriting, or is that taken into account by early training?
Because, yes, it is taken into account. And cultural differences, in the U.S., there is a much wider variety. In many other countries, like say if I see some handwriting from somebody from the Philippines, I can identify it right away as somebody from the Philippines, or somebody from Eastern Europe, for instance, or from the Middle East. There are strong cultural characteristics. And so those things do have to be taken into account in handwriting authentication. We have to look at everything. Anything that might affect handwriting is going to be important.
Can you repeat where to find the one-on-one sources of exemplars?
Sure. Let's go back to that slide. It's on my website. Oops, there it goes, SheilaLowe.com, and then you have to do the capitals exactly, HWI, and then lowercase NFO / uppercase QDE. And at SheilaLowe.com, in the handwriting identification page, there's other information that might be useful.
Is it legal to use handwriting analysis in the hiring process?
Yes, absolutely. And some of my work entails that. We've written to the employment, I can't think of the name right now, but the government entities, and they've said that they have no reason to say that we can't do it. And for anybody who's interested, I write a mystery series about a forensic handwriting expert, which I have on the screen now. But handwriting analysis has been used for many, many years in employment profiling. That's a very small part of my work now. I do mostly handwriting authentication, but companies of all sizes and types find it really helpful. I have a company that hires people to train bomb-sniffing dogs. And what I do is compare the personality traits that they're looking for the job to the handwriting to see if the person has those traits or if they have any red flags for danger.
What information can you get from a signature?
Information about, we're still talking about personality. I like to say that a signature by itself is like looking at a photograph of somebody's nose. You can see some things, but it's very limited. It's really important to look at more handwriting along with the signature. So, there's you can see different things with different types of signatures. And by the way, the easiest signature to forge is a scrawly one. The clearest signature that's very complex is much harder to forge. So if you have a scrawly signature, you might think about changing it.
Do you have to meet in person for you to analyze someone's handwriting?
Oh, no. Most of my clients I never meet. So they just either send it by FedEx or, if there's not an original, a high-resolution scan, and I send them back a report. And, of course, there's always the phone.
Since no one writes anymore, does this mean that handwriting analysis is going to, quote, quote, die out?
Well, it's not true that no one writes anymore. And as a matter of fact, an organization of which I'm president, the American Handwriting Analysis Foundation, has a grassroots movement called the Campaign for Cursive, and I addressed the Oklahoma State Legislation Education Committee a couple weeks ago on this subject. And many states are returning the requirement to teach cursive writing to the curriculum. Since they took it out in 2009, 11 states have passed legislation to return it, and 6 more are currently in process, and there are others who are looking at the subject. People do still write.
Okay. Our last question is, Does the hand you write with affect your handwriting?
In some very subtle ways, but the hand that you write with is one of the things that we cannot tell about a person from their handwriting. You can't tell their age, their gender, or which hand they write with. But their personality is certainly going to come through just like in a right-handed person or somebody who writes with a pen in their mouth or between their toes. So you have to look at the individual writing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In addition to being your best source for testifying and consulting experts for the past 60 years, TASA also offers e-discovery and forensic solutions, free interactive webinars, day-in-the-life videos, research reports on expert witnesses, including the Challenge History Report 2.0, Preliminary Screening Report, and Expert Profile 360. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Sheila Lowe for her time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Sheila, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. Thank you for attending. This concludes our program for today.